There is a man standing outside St. James's Palace right now who has not cried in 11 years. Not because nothing has happened to him. Not because his life has been smooth or easy or free of grief. But because somewhere along the way, and he cannot tell you exactly when, the part of him that allowed those things just quietly closed, like a door that no one slammed. It just drifted shut, and then the latch caught, and he stopped noticing it was locked. His name is Corporal Daniel Marsh, 31 years old, 6 feet and 1 inch tall, brown eyes that don't blink often enough to be comfortable if you're standing in front of them. He has been a member of the Household Cavalry for 9 years. Before that, 2 tours, one in Afghanistan, one that he doesn't talk about even to his mother when she calls on Sundays. He stands at his post on a Tuesday in late October. The sky over London is doing that thing it does in autumn, not quite raining, not quite not raining. The air has weight, the kind that settles into your collar and stays there. The tourists are still out, of course. They're always out. You could have a biblical flood moving through the mall, and there would still be someone from Ohio trying to get a selfie with a guard. Daniel doesn't think about the tourists anymore. He used to. In his first year, he would stand there and notice things: the child who pointed at him like he was a monument, the elderly couple who walked past arguing and then went quiet when they saw him, as if his stillness embarrassed them into it. He noticed all of that once. The way you notice the smell of a place when you first walk in, and then stop noticing it completely after 5 minutes. Now he just stands. The position itself is not uncomfortable to him. Not anymore. His body learned long ago how to carry itself without effort. Spine straight, shoulders level, hands at his sides, gaze forward at a fixed point approximately 40 meters away, and slightly elevated, so that he is always looking just past any face that tries to find his. That's intentional. Looking at a face means reacting to one, and reaction is the enemy of the post. That's not something they wrote down in any manual. It's something the older guards passed on with their body language more than their words. You watch them long enough and you understand. You don't look at the people. You look through them. By 10:30, there is a school group outside the gates. Somewhere around 30 children, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing the same shade of yellow safety vest. They have a teacher at the front who keeps raising her arm like she's trying to call a taxi, and 2 others at the back who look like they've been awake since before the children were born. Daniel registers all of this without moving his eyes. One of the children, a boy near the front of the group, has broken away slightly from the cluster. Not far, just enough that he's closer to Daniel than the others. The boy's looking up at him with an expression that isn't awe or mockery or the usual gaping curiosity. It's something more specific, something almost worried. Daniel doesn't react. He never reacts. But he notices. The teacher calls the boy back. The boy doesn't move immediately. He takes another second, just one more second, and then turns and rejoins the group. The morning passes the way mornings do at the post. Slow and loud at the same time. Tourists come. Tourists leave. Someone tries to make Daniel laugh. They always try, and they always fail, and they always seem vaguely proud of themselves for having tried. A man in a red jacket with a camera the size of a small dog crouches in front of him and takes 17 photographs in rapid succession. Daniel counts them without meaning to. He counts a lot of things without meaning to. Steps, seconds, faces. It keeps the mind disciplined without letting it drift. At 11:42, the shift changes. Daniel walks back into the guardroom with the same bearing he carries outside. Some of the men shed the posture the moment they're inside. Shoulders drop, jaws loosen, voices come back. Daniel takes a little longer. It's a thing the others have noticed, but stopped commenting on. In his early years, one of the senior guardsmen, a sergeant named Beale who had the face of someone who had seen too many Christmases, sat across from him in the canteen and said, "You carry the post home with you, Marsh." Not an accusation, more like an observation from a doctor reading a chart. Daniel had said, "Does it show?" Beale had said, "Only to people who know what they're looking at." That conversation was 7 years ago. Beale retired the following spring. Daniel still thinks about it more than he thinks about most things. He changes out of his ceremonial kit in a room that smells of polish and old wool. The sounds of the palace grounds are muffled in here. The traffic from the mall, the distant blur of tourists, the pigeons that own every flat surface in this city. He sits on the bench for a moment with his jacket across his knees and stares at the floor. He is not thinking about anything specific. That's the thing people don't understand about men like him. They assume this stillness is full of something, trauma, memory, suppressed feeling. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's genuinely just stillness. The absence of noise. A mind that has been trained to quiet itself so thoroughly that it actually does. His phone buzzes on the bench beside him. He looks at it. The name on the screen is Marcus. Marcus is his younger brother, 26, lives in Bristol, works in logistics, which Daniel has never fully understood, but supports enthusiastically. Marcus is the type of person who sends voice notes instead of texts, who laughs at his own jokes before the punchline, who once drove 4 hours to bring Daniel a birthday cake because he thought Daniel seemed lonely over the phone and didn't want to say so directly. Daniel picks up the phone. The message is not a voice note this time. She had the baby. This morning. Everyone's fine. She's beautiful, Dan. Come whenever you can. Asterisk Daniel reads it twice. Then a third time. She. Marcus's wife, Priya. They've been expecting since March. Daniel knew this. He had sent a gift. Something from a list Priya had shared. Something practical. He couldn't remember what exactly. He had made a note in his phone to check in closer to the due date. He had not checked in. He sits with the phone in his hand. He should feel something large and warm. He knows that. He knows this is the kind of moment that produces that, the announcement of a new life, a niece, a piece of family arriving into the world on a gray Tuesday in October. He knows what this is supposed to feel like. He feels something. He does. But it comes from far away, like a sound through water. Like he's pressing his hand against a warm window rather than walking through the door. He types back. Asterisk, that's wonderful. Congratulations to both of you. I'll come soon. Asterisk, he looks at the message for a moment. Then he adds, asterisk, she's beautiful. I'm glad. Asterisk, he sends it and puts the phone face down on the bench. Outside, in the corridor, he can hear two of the younger guards laughing about something. One of them, Private Holt, 22 years old and still surprised by everything, has a laugh that fills rooms. It's the kind of laugh that makes other people laugh without knowing why. Daniel has heard it every shift for the past 4 months and has never once been pulled into it. Not for lack of trying, but it's like trying to warm your hands on a photograph of a fire. You know it's the right shape. You know what it's supposed to do. But the heat is somewhere behind the image. He puts on his jacket, straightens his collar, and walks out. The afternoon shift is quieter. The school group is long gone. The tourists have thinned in that mid-afternoon lull before the 4 o'clock surge. The sky has committed to gray without committing to rain. Daniel is back at the post by 1:15. He stands. At 2:30, the boy comes back. Not the group, just the boy. He's with a woman now. His mother, Daniel assumes, from the way she holds his hand, loosely but close, the way parents hold hand with children who are old enough to be embarrassed by it, but young enough to still want it. They're walking along the pavement opposite the gate. Not approaching, just passing. But the boy sees Daniel, and he stops. The mother keeps walking 2 steps, then notices and turns. She says something. The boy doesn't move. He's looking at Daniel with that same expression from the morning. That particular look. Daniel has been looked at in every way possible in 9 years of this. Curiosity, mockery, admiration, pity, the tourist's blank, blinking wonder. He knows all of them. He has cataloged them. This one is different. The boy looks like he's trying to figure out if Daniel is okay. Not if he's real. Not if he'll move. Not if he's allowed to take a photograph. He looks like he's looking at a person and seeing something that concerns him. The way a child sees things before they learn that certain things are not their business. Daniel does not move. The mother pulls the boy gently. They move on. Daniel stares at his fixed point, 40 meters away and slightly elevated. And something not large, not dramatic, just something small and quiet shifts. He doesn't know what to call it. He doesn't call it anything. He just stands there at his post and notices that the late afternoon light is doing something unusual to the stone of the palace gates, turning them almost amber. The The kind of light that doesn't last. The kind that only exists for about 4 minutes, and then the clouds close again, and it's gone. He watches it while it lasts. That evening, sitting in his flat in Pimlico, a small place, neat, very few photographs, he calls Marcus instead of texting. Marcus picks up on the second ring, surprised. Daniel almost never calls. Done? Hey, you got my message. I did. Congratulations. She's incredible, mate. She's got Priya's nose and my ears, which is unfortunate for her. We're calling her Nadia. Nadia. That's a good name, Daniel says. You should come this weekend. Priya wants you there. And, honestly, Marcus pauses. I want you there. Daniel looks at the wall across from where he's sitting. There's a patch of paint near the window that's been slightly discolored since he moved in. He's looked at it every evening for 3 years. He has never once thought about painting over it. I'll come Saturday, he says. Marcus says something warm and loud, and Daniel holds the phone a little away from his ear. But he doesn't end the call. He lets Marcus talk. About Nadia, about the hospital, about Priya, about the drive back, about a nurse who made a joke that was genuinely funny. He lets it all come in. He doesn't say much. He never does. But he doesn't close the door. That night, for the first time in a long while, he sits on his bed before sleeping and thinks about what the boy's face looked like. Not the tourists, not the shift, not the messages or the calls or the small wait of the afternoon. Just that face. That particular, careful, concerned little face looking up at him through the gate like it was the most natural thing in the world to wonder if a soldier was all right. Daniel wonders when he stopped wondering that about himself. He doesn't have an answer, but he keeps the question. And that, for now, is something. Saturday came the way things do when you've said yes to them before you were ready. Daniel took the 742 from Paddington. He had his bag, small, military habit, he never overpacks, and a card he'd bought at the station because he'd forgotten to buy one beforehand, and a stuffed rabbit he'd found in a shop near the platform. He stood in front of the display for 4 minutes, picking up items and putting them down, which is not something he normally does. Usually he decides fast and doesn't revisit, but he stood there with a rabbit in one hand and a small wooden toy in the other, and felt genuinely, slightly, absurdly uncertain. He bought the rabbit. On the train, he sat by the window and watched London thin out into suburb and suburb thin out into fields. He had his jacket folded on his lap. He didn't sleep, though the motion of the train usually pulls him toward it. He just watched the distance. He tried to remember the last time he'd visited Bristol. 2 years ago, maybe closer to 3. It had been summer. Marcus had cooked. He was a decent cook, better than Daniel by considerable distance. And Priya had been there, they were newly married, and the evening had been warm and slightly loud, and Daniel had left earlier than he should have. He'd said he had an early start. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that somewhere around 9 in the evening, sitting in their kitchen while Marcus poured another glass of something and laughed at something Priya said, Daniel had felt the particular loneliness of being present, and not quite there. The kind where you're in the room, you're smiling, you're responding correctly, and there's still a pane of glass between you and everything. And the longer you sit with it, the more aware of it you become, until it's almost unbearable without being dramatic enough to explain to anyone. So he'd left. He was good at leaving before things got that far. Marcus's house was a terrace in Bedminster. Red brick, small garden, a fig tree by the front wall that had no business surviving an English winter, but persisted anyway, which Daniel had always privately respected. He rang the bell at 10:15. Marcus opened the door wearing a look that was almost exclusively composed of tiredness and love. Not conflicting. Somehow exactly the same thing, at least in that moment. You came, he said. I said I would. You say things, Dan. But he said it with a half smile, not an accusation. He stepped back. Colmeen. She's asleep. She's barely ever asleep. So we're speaking in the volume of monks. Daniel stepped inside. The house smelled different than he remembered. Warmer. There was something floral, not perfume, something softer, and underneath it the small hours smell of a house that has been lived in hard over the last 4 days. There, laundered cotton, a faint trace of hospital that hadn't quite been aired out yet. He left his shoes at the door without being asked. Priya was in the sitting room, on the sofa, wrapped in something large and gray. She had the face of a woman who had done something extraordinary and was not yet sure she believed it herself. She looked up when Daniel came in. Done? Her voice was quieter than usual. I'm glad you're here. How are you feeling? He asked. Like I ran a marathon, and then someone handed me something that needs me constantly. She smiled. Also, she looks like Marcus. I'm choosing to find that endearing. She does not look like me, Marcus said from the kitchen doorway. She looks like a very wise old woman. That's what I said. She looks like you. Daniel sat down in the chair across from the sofa. He put his bag beside him. He looked at Priya and then at the small bundle beside her in the Moses basket, the edge of a white blanket, a faint crease of pink, and said nothing. He just looked. Priya noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She just watched him look. Do you want to hold her? She asked. He didn't answer immediately, which was already unusual for him, because Daniel Marsh did not hesitate over small things. He was built for fast assessment and faster response. But he sat with the question for a full 5 seconds. Yes, he said. She showed him how to pick her up. He knew the mechanics. He'd held babies before, distantly, at the weddings or christenings of colleagues, the brief, obligatory hold and return. But Priya showed him anyway, and he let her, and then Nadia was in his arms. She weighed almost nothing. That was the first thought, and it was stupid. He knew newborns were light, but his body was still surprised by it. How something that had just arrived in the world could be this small, this specific. Her face was scrunched, and her eyes were closed, and she had a faint crease across her forehead like she was working something out, and her hand were the size of things Daniel didn't have a reference for. Not coins, not leaves, just very small and real and folded under her chin like she was already thinking. He looked at her for a long time. She doesn't like strangers much, Marcus said, watching from the doorway. She screams at the midwife every time. Daniel said nothing. Nadia did not scream. She made a small sound, not quite a word, not quite a complaint, just a sound of existing, and turned her face slightly toward the warmth of his chest, and then was quiet again. Marcus made a noise in the doorway that he tried to disguise as clearing his throat. Priya looked at the ceiling. Daniel held his niece and stood very still, the way he knew how to stand still, except that this time the stillness wasn't armor. It was something else. He wasn't sure what. He stood with it anyway. Later, after Nadia had been put down, after lunch had been made and eaten, after Marcus had fallen asleep on the sofa mid-sentence, and Priya had laughed softly and covered him with a gray blanket, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea he wasn't drinking. Priya came in and made herself something herbal. She sat across from him. They had always had a decent ease with each other, him and Priya, without having talked extensively. She was a perceptive person who did not require reciprocation as a condition of conversation, which suited Daniel perfectly. She would talk, and he would listen, and she never seemed bothered by the imbalance. But today she didn't talk first. She just wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at him. You all right? She said finally. He looked at his tea. Marcus says you're always all right, she added, which means he never actually asks you. Daniel didn't say anything immediately. I held a baby before, he said after a moment. Colleagues at his christening. For years ago. I held him for maybe a minute and gave him back. And it felt like holding a bag of something. I mean that kindly. It just felt like an object being passed between people. He paused. Today felt different. Priya waited. I don't know why, he said. She's a baby. She doesn't know me. She can't know anything yet. But when he stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. She turned toward me. She does that with warmth, Priya said gently. It's instinct. She can't see properly yet. I know, Daniel said. I know that. He picked up his mug. It still did something. Priya looked at him with the kind of careful attention that doesn't perform itself. When was the last time something did something? She asked. He didn't answer that one. Not because he was refusing, but because he was actually trying to remember. He was sitting there, at her kitchen table, with the sound of Marcus snoring faintly from the next room, and a fig tree visible through the window, doing nothing in particular, and genuinely trying to trace it back. He could find fragments, things that had moved around in him without breaking the surface. The day Beale retired and shook his hand at the door and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. A piece of music that came on in the canteen 3 months ago. He didn't know what it was. He never found out that had made him stop eating for about 30 seconds. Letters from his mother that he read and folded carefully and put in the same drawer and never quite responded to as fully as they deserved. But something breaking through, something landing, he couldn't find one. "You've been doing this a long time," Priya said. "Not the regiment. The other thing, the managing of it." "I'm fine," he said. "Old habit." The words were out before he could choose them. Priya nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. She didn't push. But as she got up to go check on Marcus, she paused at the door. "She'll want to know you," she said. "Nadia, when she's older. She'll want her uncle." "Don't." She seemed to choose her next word carefully. "Don't let the post follow you here." She left. Daniel sat alone at the table. Outside, a cloud shifted. The October light came through the kitchen window in a flat, golden pour, the kind that doesn't last, the same kind he'd noticed outside St. James's 4 days ago, the kind that turns ordinary stone into something briefly worth looking at. It fell across the table, across his hands. He sat in it. He didn't leave early. He stayed for dinner. He stayed until Nadia woke up crying at 6:30, and Marcus stumbled blearily into the sitting room and picked her up wrong and adjusted and got it right. He stayed until Priya laughed at Marcus, and Marcus made a face, and the three of them were there in the sitting room with the baby under the lamp and the television off and the noise of Bedminster coming in low through the window. He stayed until it was almost 9, and he did not feel the glass. Not completely. Not all evening. There were moments when it flickered, when he found himself slightly outside the warmth, watching from slightly too far away. But then something would pull him back. Marcus asking him a question. Priya handing him his tea. Nadia making that sound, that small sound of existing. He took the last train back. On the platform at Bristol Temple Meads, waiting, he took out his phone. He looked at it for a moment. Then he typed a message to his mother. Not a reply to anything specific, just a message. Asking how she was. Saying he'd been in Bristol. Saying he was thinking about coming to see her sometime soon. Not promising. Just saying it. He sent it. He got on the train. He sat by the window again. He watched the fields go back to suburb, suburb go back to city, city closing around him the way it always does, familiar and fast and indifferent. He thought about the boy again, outside the palace gate. That worried, careful face. He thought, I used to look like that. Before whatever happened. Before the door. I used to look at people and wonder if they were all right. He thought, maybe that's not entirely gone. Maybe it's just been standing very still for a very long time. Waiting the way he knew how to wait. For something to turn toward it. He went back to the post on Monday. It was colder than it had been. The kind of cold that arrives properly in November. Not the teasing chill of October. Real cold. The sort that makes the ceremonial uniform feel both entirely appropriate and completely inadequate at the same time. His hands stayed at his sides. His face stayed forward. The fixed point, 40 meters away, slightly elevated. Same as always. But something was different, and he knew it, and he didn't like knowing it. Not because the difference was bad, just because difference, in general, disrupts the machinery. And he had learned to love the machinery. Or, if not love it exactly, then depend on it. The way a man who has lived on plain food for years develops a distrust of anything with too much flavor. You forget that the flavor was the point. He had been standing for 40 minutes when Private Holt appeared in his peripheral vision, walking the far edge of the forecourt. Holt had that particular young soldier gait, chest slightly too forward, chin slightly too high, overcorrecting for confidence. He'd been doing it for 8 months, and it was softening slowly. He'd be good eventually. Maybe very good. Holt glanced at Daniel as he passed. He didn't say anything. That was the rule, and Holt knew it. But he looked, and Daniel, not moving, not reacting, not turning his head a millimeter, received the look, and cataloged it. It was the same look Holt always gave him. Part study, part slight wariness. The way young soldiers look at the older ones who don't seem to need anything. Not admiration exactly, more like taking a measurement and not being sure if the result is something to aspire to. Daniel had never thought much about that look before. He thought about it now. He thought, what does it cost? Not the standing. The standing was easy, easier than breathing, easier than talking, easier than being in a sitting room in Bedminster with people who loved him and feeling the warmth without quite touching it. That was the easy part. The post, the stillness, the face that gave nothing. He thought about what it had originally cost to build all of that, whether he had built it deliberately or whether it had just grown around him the way scar tissue does. Uninvited, unplanned, doing its job so efficiently that you stop noticing the wound it was covering was already healed. The morning moved. Tourists came and went. A woman tried to involve him in a video for her phone. She spoke into it while pointing at him, walking sideways, narrating something he couldn't hear. He stared through her. She moved on. At 11:10, an older man stopped in front of him. Not a tourist, or not performing being one. He was somewhere in his late 60s, a solid, deliberate sort of man, wearing a good overcoat and holding a paper bag from a bakery near Pall Mall. He wasn't performing anything. He wasn't pointing a camera. He just stopped and looked at Daniel the way you'd look at something you'd walked past 100 times and suddenly, for no particular reason, decided to properly see. He stood there for maybe 20 seconds, which is longer than it sounds. Most people who stop do so for 4 or 5 seconds before the awkwardness of it sends them on. 20 seconds is a committed pause. Then, the man said, very quietly, "Good morning." He wasn't waiting for a response. He knew the protocol. He just said it the way you'd say it to someone in passing, the way you say it, because it feels like the right thing regardless of whether it lands anywhere. Then, he walked on, towards St. James's Street, without looking back. Daniel watched him go, without moving his head, just followed the figure with his peripheral vision until it was gone. Good morning. He couldn't have said why it stayed with him. It was 2 words. People said things all the time. People made noise in front of him constantly. But there is something in the directness of it, not performed, not trying to get a reaction, not a test. Just a human acknowledgement. You exist. I see that. Good morning. He breathed slowly. The afternoon arrived. At 2:30, during what should have been the quietest part of the day, a woman fainted. Not dramatically, not the kind of collapse that drops someone full length on the pavement. She went down against the railings about 12 meters to his left in the slow folding way of someone who has lost purchase rather than consciousness. She was probably 60, wearing a green coat, carrying a tote bag with a museum name on it. She made it to a sitting position against the base of the fence and stayed there, breathing. The tourists nearby noticed. There was the usual cluster reaction. People gathering, phones appearing, 2 young women crouching beside her and asking questions in loud, concerned voices. Daniel had already moved, not running, fast and quiet, the way he'd been taught to move in spaces that didn't want panic added to them. He was beside her in under 10 seconds, crouching on the other side from the 2 women, checking her face, checking her color, asking her quietly, directly, what her name was and whether she could hear him. She could. Her name was Janet. She was warm, and her pulse was strong, and she said she hadn't eaten since 7 and had been on her feet since 9:30. Sit still for a minute, he told her. Don't stand up yet. He looked at one of the young women, the calmer of the 2. Can you get water? There's a cafe on the corner. They'll give you a bottle. The woman went immediately. Someone in the gathered crowd said, should we call an ambulance? Daniel looked at Janet. Her color was already coming back. Not yet. Do you have any medical conditions? Heart, blood pressure. Blood pressure, she said. I take something for it. I took it this morning and didn't eat after. I forgot. He stayed crouched beside her, not hovering, just present. He'd seen men go down in worse conditions than this, and the thing that helped them most wasn't noise or urgency. It was stillness. Someone who wasn't panicking. Someone who had decided the situation was manageable and communicated that with their body before their words. The water arrived. He helped her hold the bottle. She drank slowly. He stayed until she was up, until the color had fully returned, and her voice was steady, and she was embarrassed, the way people always are when their body makes a scene in public. He walked her to a bench 10 meters back from the gates. He waited until she was settled with her tote bag in her lap, and a biscuit from the bottom of it that she'd found, slightly crushed, and was eating with the resigned determination of someone who knew they'd earned it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. I thought you weren't allowed to move." "I'm not allowed to react to tourists," he said. "You needed help." "That's different." She looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were very clear, the kind of clear that sharp, observant people keep well into old age. She said, "Are you all right?" He blinked. It was the third time in a week someone had asked him that. The boy's face through the gate. Priya at the kitchen table. And now Janet on a bench outside St. James's Palace with a crushed biscuit in her hand. "Yes," he said. "Automatic." She looked at him a moment longer. "Okay," she said, in exactly the way Priya had said it. Not dismissing the answer, just accepting it for now. He went back to the post. He stood there for the remainder of the shift. The sun dropped behind the buildings the way it does in November, early and without ceremony. The light went flat. The tourists thinned. The city got on with itself. He stood, but inside, somewhere that the post couldn't reach, somewhere the fixed point 40 meters away didn't govern. Something was happening that he didn't have the vocabulary for, and wasn't sure he wanted to find. It wasn't warmth exactly. It wasn't the opening of something. It was more like an awareness of the fact that there was a door, that he had a door, that he had not thought about it as a door in a very long time, had thought of it instead as just the wall, and had arranged his whole life comfortably against it. The door was still there. That evening he called his mother. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd had the phone nearby since his message. She always had it nearby, but this was different. This was the having it nearby of someone who had been trying not to hope. "Daniel," she said. A pause. Not uncomfortable. "You said you might come and visit." "I did. I wasn't going to mention it in case you'd changed your mind." "I haven't changed my mind." She made a sound. Not words. Just a sound that a person makes when something they kept very small and carefully inside them is briefly allowed to be a little bigger. He talked to her for 40 minutes, which was the longest he'd talked to anyone on the phone in. He couldn't remember. He asked about the house. He asked about her neighbor whose name he'd forgotten, and she told him again, and he tried to hold it this time. He told her about Bristol, about Nadia, about the rabbit he'd bought on the platform. She laughed at the rabbit. He let her laugh. He didn't rush past it. When he hung up, he sat in his flat in Pimlico and looked at the patch of discolored paint on the wall. He thought, "I should paint that. Not dramatically, not as metaphor, just as a practical thing." He'd been looking at it for 3 years and thinking about it and not doing it, and there was no reason not to do it except that changing something that had become familiar required a small act of decision. A small announcement that the thing as it was not how you wanted it to be. He thought about Nadia, 2 days old, turning toward warmth with no reasoning and no strategy and no assessment of whether the warmth would stay. Just turning, because turning was the right thing, and her body knew it even when her mind didn't. He thought about the boy at the gate. That face, that worried, careful, entirely undefended face, looking up at a man in armor and asking with its expression what no child had the words for. "Are you in there?" He thought about Janet eating her crushed biscuit with dignity, about Marcus crying into his phone and pretending he wasn't, about Priya saying, "Don't let the post follow you here," about Beale, 7 years ago, reading a chart. He thought, "I'm still in here." The thought surprised him. Not the content, the sureness of it. He hadn't known that was something he needed to affirm. But apparently it was. Apparently somewhere along the way, between the tours and the post and the years of standing still through everything, he had started to confuse being composed with being absent, as if the door being closed meant no one was home. He went to bed earlier than usual. He left the window open a crack, which he never did, because the November air comes in cold and specific, and he preferred his room sealed. But he left it open. He lay in the dark and listened to the sounds of Pimlico, A bus. A couple arguing briefly and then laughing. Someone's door. The wind moving through something that rustled. A tree, maybe, or a window ledge, he wasn't sure. He was asleep within 8 minutes. He didn't dream about anything particular. He just slept, full and real, and the way sleep is supposed to work as rest, as recovery, as the body insisting on its own restoration even when the mind has forgotten to ask for it. In the morning, he was back at the post by 7:45. The sky was clear. The first genuinely clear sky in a week, the kind where the blue is almost aggressive, where every edge of every building is too sharp, and the light makes everything look like it's been cleaned overnight. The guards came and went. The tourists arrived. The mall filled up with joggers, with children, with people who had somewhere to be, and people who didn't. Daniel stood. But when Holt passed him on the early inspection, that same look, that same measurement, Daniel, for the first time in as long as he could remember, let something into his face. Not a smile. Not a break from the post. Nothing visible enough to be a reaction. Just the faintest ease around the eyes. The faintest release of something held. Holt noticed. He didn't say anything. He walked on. But Daniel knew he'd noticed, and it didn't bother him. He stood at his post on a clear November morning in front of St. James's Palace with the sounds of London all around him. The buses and the children and the pigeons and the distant permanent hum of a city that doesn't stop. And he stood the way he always stood, straight and still and absolutely present. But he stopped looking through the people. Just slightly. Just enough to remember what it felt like to look at them. He was still a royal guard. He was still Corporal Daniel Marsh, 9 years in, spine straight, gaze forward, hands at his sides. He was just also, quietly and without ceremony, a man who had been reminded that he was one. And sometimes that's how it starts. Not with anything large. Not with anything that breaks you open or announces itself. Just a door you forgot was there. Just a child's worried face. Just an old woman with a crushed biscuit asking if you're all right. Just someone turning toward warmth. And you realizing you still can.